Baker Tenholtz is a 6.5-foot phonographer who used to cut bee trees. It was through cutting bee trees that he first developed an interest in phonography. When hunting hives, he explained to me, it is necessary to have a way of remembering which trees contain honey. There might be 15 or 20 honey trees scattered around a small wood. Chasing the bees around to determine which trees they're using, lining the bees, or coursing them, a hunter has no time to lose. When he finds some bees swarming into a knothole, he marks the bark with his knife or ties a ribbon on the trunk before running on to the next tree. Afterward, he strolls through the wood, locating by his marks the bee trees, harvesting the wild comb honey with a smoking rag. Tenholtz was born in 1932 in Eudora, Arkansas, and as a boy he made a good summertime living off bee trees. He marked his trees with a 10-inch Bowie knife. After a few seasons, he found that he was more interested in coming up with new markings than in pulling out comb. He had a basic hash mark that indicated whether or not the trees had bees. And by crossing the hash mark perpendicularly at different heights, he could indicate the location of the knothole. Dots arrayed around the mark recorded the bees' particular ferocity. I became very interested in this, he told me. I was wondering how much information can be covered by a few simple marks on a tree. My range was limited by tools and materials, but in no time I discovered that with a small alphabet of symbols I could express a wealth of information. Not only were the bees aggressive, but where had I first picked them up? Was it by a stream? Had I seen a wild turkey on the far bank? And how was the weather? Did it look like rain? I got pretty good on those kinds of questions, and then I started trying to record other matters. Soon enough, on a tree with good, smooth bark, I could put down most any current event. I'd never heard of Isaac Pitman at that time. I was just pursuing a childish diversion. Of course, I had to practice. I filled up half the notebooks in town working out my characters with a pen and paper. But what I really liked was to carve something on a tree, where it would stay put and stupefy anyone who happened upon it. Nowadays, the trees have grown so much I would imagine my inscriptions are unrecognizable. Several years later, in a typing class, Tenholtz came across an old edition of Pitman shorthand, the first comprehensive system of abbreviated writing to be taught in the United States. On the page it looks somewhat like Arabic, with short hooking characters and flickering embellishments. It has a phonetic basis, which is why some people call it phonography. Tenholtz's first glimpse of a text in Pitman shorthand was very nearly a mystical experience. The system made his bee tree glyphs look crude and unwieldy, but it also seemed familiar, strange, and beautiful. He said it was like looking at a note you might have written to yourself in your sleep and cannot remember writing. He learned it in 4 days. From Pitman shorthand, he moved on to Gregg shorthand, a loopier script that looks more like cursive. Soon he was an adept at virtually every form of shorthand known to man. He picked up Boyd's syllabic, electric cross, Gablesberger, Thomas, Pullis, Faulkner, Dutton Speedword, Salzer, Yerian, Briefhand, Universal, and even as more of a party trick than anything else, some small bits of Tyronian notes named for Marcus Tullius Tyro, a Roman scribe who devised the 4,000-character system to record the speeches of Cicero. Most stenographers end up as court reporters, but Tenholtz never did, mostly because he disliked machine shorthand, which was standard by the 1950s. Machines took all the fun out of it, he felt, and more importantly, they were bulky and inconvenient. Nevertheless, he mastered the stenograph and in 1954 won the National Court Reporters Association speed contest with no errors on the 280 words per minute jury charge. Afterward, he made headlines for publicly denouncing the association's endorsement of shorthand machines, claiming that no device has done more to ruin the fine and noble pursuit of shorthand pen writing. Tenholtz and I first crossed paths on March 28, 2004, in a supermarket in Houston. He was standing in front of a refrigerated case of ready-to-eat dishes, buffalo wings, wilted Caesar salads, thick squares of King Ranch casserole, shaking his head and muttering, "What is the point of this?" As I walked past, he turned slightly and caught my eye, and although I was in the sort of mood that makes casual conversation with strangers seem nearly impossible, I hesitated and smiled ruefully, as if to agree, though I had no idea what he was talking about. "Why do they do this?" he asked me, his voice raspy with age. His hair consisted of 40 or 50 wisps above a liver-spotted dome, and his gaunt frame was bent slightly over a wooden rubber-footed cane, which he gradually lifted and used as a pointer to indicate a sign above the display case that read, "Meals to go." Meals to go. There isn't any point, as far as I can tell, to that letter Z at the end of meals, he said. It doesn't make the word any shorter or easier to read. I agreed that the spelling was both useless and idiotic and continued on my way, but he was not done. He brought his cane down, drew a notepad from his breast pocket, and scribbled furiously for a few moments. Writing up his complaint, I thought. He seemed like one of those tiresome half-mad geezers who search public buildings for something to dislike, a self-appointed inspector of the world's many defects. I could imagine him pestering the store's manager, refusing to accept that the S had been changed to a Z, simply to enliven an otherwise pedestrian sign. "But it does nothing of the sort," he would protest. "It only gives the impression of having been written by a 10-year-old. And the manager, frustrated but slightly bemused, "Listen, buddy, I don't know what to tell you. I don't make the signs. I just put them up." "Of course you don't. No one is responsible for anything anymore." Not that I disagreed with him. My outlook at the time shared much with that of a dyspeptic old codger. I had $8,000 and no clue how to turn my race notes into a piece of journalism. I'd found a cheap apartment in a low-rise complex off Bissonnette inhabited mostly by Mexican immigrants, men, they were all men, who knew Zacatecas well and were baffled and amused to find a gringo who'd lived there. They had all heard of the Pallet King, and some knew of the Carrera Panamericana too. My Mexican sojourn had done nothing to advance my career, but it had made me a source of endless curiosity for my neighbors. Some of these men had interesting stories, but I didn't bother to draw them out or to take notes. I was through with journalism. I spent most of my time under the air at the public library, aimlessly searching Craigslist for some barter item or job opportunity that would give my life a new purpose. Piano lessons? An Olympic weight set? A 4-month-old Welsh painted pony? Teaching English in rural Java. One day, scouring the ride shares, I came across someone looking for a companion to share the driving out to Terlingua, a small desert town south of Marfa. The anonymous author of this query would depart on April 22nd and return 3 days later. The next morning I replied to the ad, offering my services. The poster wrote back with several paragraphs. There was no signature, but from the address, Ann1944@AOL.com, I gathered that she was a woman. There was a lot to digest in her email. She explained that she was going to Terlingua to take part in an Adobe workshop hosted by a woman named Ruby Prentice, a disciple of the world-famous Mexican Adobe architect Joaquin Tenorio. My interest in mud brick architecture stems from my interest in this remarkable woman, Ann 1944 offered. She said that she no longer drove long distances without a companion because she had bad night vision and wouldn't like to end up sleeping on the side of the road if the trip took longer than expected. "Surgery might help," she wrote, "but I refuse to let a doctor fiddle with my eyeballs. Doctors nowadays think they can fix everything, but half of them can't even take your temperature. Besides, I'm not sure they should be allowed to fix everything. It's only a way for them to run up bills. People should learn to live with their defects." Needless to say, I was taken with my correspondent's digressive style and began to look forward to our 10-hour drive, convinced that I would be hearing a great deal more not only about Ruby Prentice, Joaquin Tenorio, and the shortcomings of modern medicine, but also about Ann 1944 herself. Who was she? A lonely River Oaks dilettante? An aging hippie swept up in the green building craze? Neither, as it turned out. She wasn't even a woman. She was Baker Tenholtz, a 6.5-foot tall phonographer who used to cut bee trees.